Well, hello there. So in this video, we're going to talk about fiscal policy. And so there's really two tools in the toolbox that policymakers have to address when the economy isn't doing very well. So remember, our very first question we asked in Unit 6 was, how's the economy doing? In this unit, we're developing a model where we can figure out how we model it. And then this unit's where we also dip our toes into what do we do about it, right? The second question. Next unit, we're also going to look at a little bit of the other tools in the toolbox, and that's monetary policy. So that's kind of where we start here. Fiscal policy defined, fiscal, by the way, not, so maybe I'm just going to put here so you don't get confused. This is not physical, right? This is fiscal. And it actually comes from fiscus. This is a little money purse. And so if you imagine the government and it has its little money bag, this is the government spending or taxes or transfers. So if the government writes you a $600 check because it's the pandemic, right, that is a transfer. And so that's those pandemic checks that went out. When they collect your taxes, that's a tax, and a spending on goods and services, right? Goods and services. Now, the other type of stabilization policy, how we stabilize the economy, it's what we call monetary policy. That's changes in the money supply, so hence the name monetary, right? And that's going to be the central banks. We'll look at that in the next unit. Now, this today is just the overview of fiscal policy. And I got you this fun little graphic. This is Paul Krugman, the author of your book, appearing in a cartoon here, kind of a fun little cartoon about beards. I used to have a beard, so I put that in there, but not anymore. So you can't trust me, right? Fiscal policy in terms of why we do it. I think this is a useful quote to contextualize those. If you remember from the last topic, we talked about how the economy can correct itself, and I alluded to the notion that there's two issues with that. And one is that sometimes the recession is really bad, and it is actually difficult for the economy to correct itself for various reasons that are kind of technical. The second is actually something John Maynard Keynes said. And Keynes is really considered a founding figure in modern macroeconomics. I always call it and joke with students that he's my bay, right? So I even have a mug with him on it. He's kind of considered this founding figure. Some of his ideas haven't really kind of stuck with in economics, but some of them are still with us even today. So economists today call themselves neo-Keynesians, actually. Some of them do. And his quote, and this is true in the 1920s and 30s as much as it is, I think, today, this long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. That is by far the most famous sentence that any economist, I think, has ever said here. Maybe, right? You've got a couple arguable. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons, right, stormy times, they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, don't worry, the ocean will be flat again. And his point here is that we need to use this knowledge that we've developed about the economy to stabilize things, to reduce the severity of recessions and rein in expansions that are a little too exciting, right? Another way that sometimes people described it, and this was talking about the central bank, but basically the job of government is to keep the party going, but if it gets too wild, to take away the punch bowl, right? To kind of tune things down a little bit. Now, in this lesson, like I said, we're going to talk about the fiscal policy, and there's really two types and then another two types. So we kind of there's multiple ways of categorizing them, right? And the first way to think about it is just this broad fiscal monetary. So you've got fiscal policy, like here, me sitting at the Oval Office, changing taxes, transfers of government spending, or you've got monetary policy where you're changing, and that's the Fed in DC, where you've got changing the money supply. Within those, though, you've got other ways also of kind of categorizing. And this is true specifically for fiscal policy, although these words are also monetary. So that's kind of we'll return to expansionary and contractionary policy when we talk about monetary policy. Automatic and discretionary, another way that we kind of classify these. Fiscal policy that is automatic, we sometimes call automatic stabilizers. So if you see that, don't get scared. It just means automatic policies. And these are ones where if your income goes down because you lost your job, well, the proportion that you pay in income in taxes goes down. So that's our progressive income tax system. So our progressive tax system does that, right? If your income falls, you pay a smaller proportion of your income in taxes. Another one would be that more people would qualify for welfare or unemployment benefits, and that these kick in automatically when a recession happens, right? And likewise, when there's an expansion, these things kick in. Now, you might be reading this word over here and saying, What? This doesn't make sense. These kick in when an expansion happens, but this is contractionary. Well, that's describing the point, right? The goal. So this is saying to decrease aggregate demand, and this is to expand aggregate demand. So these policies here would expand aggregate demand. These policies here would contract aggregate demand. Now, in terms of discretionary, right, this means you have a discrete choice. And so this is to say they actually changed a law or a program. So you cut the tax rate, you created a new program, you wrote $600 checks to people, right? Those things, like that's discretionary policy in a nutshell. Now, fiscal corrections are super easy for us to model, actually. So we can just say, and actually, I just kind of go to the next slide here. So we could say you've got Y and PL, and I'm just going to draw both graphs for you so you can see them. And if you imagine that we start here at YF, or sorry, we're going to start in a recession. So I'm going to just quickly kind of draw a recession here. And how do I know this is a recession? Well, because the Y1 value is smaller than YF. That tells us we're in a recession. So the way we can increase, right, aggregate demand back to where we want it to be is by using expansionary policy, right? So this is showing expansionary policy, right? So this could be, maybe they cut the taxes, maybe they created a new government program, right? Any of that kind of stuff. And the goal here is to increase aggregate demand. Now over here, right, this is how, if the economy is getting a little too exciting, right, if that party is a little too wild, we want to rein it in. So now we're going to draw first an expansion, and we know we're in an expansion because the output level is higher than the full employment, right? So we're actually making too much, if you want to think about it another way. And the problem here, you might be saying, well, what's this a big deal? Is that it can create inflationary pressures. So we don't really want to be operating way out here. We want to be back where we used to be. And so we just kind of reduce aggregate demand in this case by using contractionary policy, right? So we could raise taxes, right? Politicians love to do that. We could cut government spending. Politicians love to do that. No, not really. At the end of the day, contractionary policy is much more rare because politicians obviously are motivated to not to do this, but expansionary policy is quite common, even among people who are ideologically kind of opposed to it. Sometimes the reality will set in and they'll say, yeah, that's all right. Yeah, we'll send out some checks, right? So kind of thinking about ideology meeting the reality, and in many cases, the reality is they want to expand economic output. Now, despite all this, right, you might be saying, okay, so that seems like you solved the problem. Why are recessions such a big deal? Well, we could fix it, but we have to kind of grapple with some issues, and I've listed out 4 of them for you. There aren't really notes that you need to take here, but maybe it would be useful to annotate a little bit. So I'm going to kind of skip this stuff and just kind of show you this. So the first issue with fiscal policy is that there's a time lag, and it actually takes time to, number one, recognize that there is a gap, right? The second is to actually decide on the plan, right? So there's actually multiple time lags. The second time lag is to develop and pass the plan, and the third is like implementing it. So at any point in that, government can move kind of slow. And so you can imagine that it could take months for these things to happen. And so we don't, we talk about fiscal policy like, oh, look at that, just like that, it fixed it. It can take time, right? So that's an issue to be aware of. The second is the politically motivated issue. So this may come as a shock to all of you. And I used to tell this joke, and kids were like, no way, politicians wouldn't do this. And now maybe kids are less likely to say, shocking at that, but politicians sometimes will manipulate the economic output and do this kind of expansionary policy to their own electoral advantage, right? So you might imagine that right before an election, it's quite popular to say, "Here's $2,000 checks," right? So that can kind of muddy the waters a little bit of policy making when we talk about that issue. Third and fourth are actually why. So I'm going to put this off to the side. Why AD might not increase as much as we think. So both of these are actually reasons why, like if you went through this policy and you said, hey, look, AD is going to move to AD2. Well, just hold on just a minute, because these two things kind of push back. It's there's a kind of pushing back against your attempt to say, well, let's just cut taxes or let's hand out money or whatever, right? There's issues that with that, and these are the kind of more technical. So the first one is called crowding out, and the way that I've explained it to students in the past is, imagine you're at a buffet, and some students actually don't really know this because you don't go to buffets, but you go to a buffet, and if you've ever been to one, they'll sometimes have this thing called crab legs. And I don't eat crab, I don't eat shellfish, but I can tell you from just observing it that when the person comes out with the tray of crab legs, there's this mob sometimes that will come and try to get it. There's these news stories of people who get into fights over the crab legs because it's a delicacy, right? And that's crowding out. And what we find is that the government is kind of the first one to run in there and grab the crab legs. And what this actually, the crab legs in this case means, is that they have to borrow money, right, to do this stuff. When they want to cut taxes, when they want to give you a check in the mail for the pandemic, when they want to spend money, oftentimes they have to borrow to do it, right? And so when they do that, they're the first person to grab the crab legs, and they don't leave any for anybody else. Now, this sometimes happens, and sometimes there's plenty of crab legs, and it doesn't matter. But in certain circumstances, when there aren't very many crab legs, the government takes them all, and then it causes other people to not be able to borrow as much because interest rates are going to rise, and so private investment will fall. And we know that, this is part of aggregate demand. So like you would say, well, the government spent $100 billion, but as a result, and they had to borrow it, right, to do it, as a result, maybe $10 billion worth of investment didn't happen. And so the true effect on aggregate demand was only $90 billion increase. And so that's what we mean when we say crowding out, because it pushes out private investment spending. The second reason why it may not increase as much as we think is something called the net export effect. And this one's a little bit like you have to think through it a little bit more. But as they do this, right, decrease taxes because blah, 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 blah. When we went from point A to point B up here, right, what happened to the price level? Well, it went up, right? And that's kind of the idea. Like we used to be at AD2, we fell to AD, and now we're going back. The problem is that when you push that price level up in any amount in your economy, it's going to cause US goods to be more expensive, right? That's kind of the definition of price levels going up. And so foreigners will buy less. And that means, XN decreases. And we know that's part of aggregate demand. So again, this is not going to be enough to overwhelm, right, the increase. It might be the government increased spending by 100 billion and 10 billion worth of investment didn't happen because of crowding out, and 5 billion worth of exports didn't happen because now the prices are higher. So really, we only increased aggregate demand by 85 billion, right? So that's kind of the way to think about these. And these are technical, but they are something that are field of research in economics. All right, so hopefully this helps you with kind of the basics of automatic versus discretionary, expansionary, contractionary policy, how we model those. I'll see you next time.